Thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. Today's podcast is from November 13th, 2016. We continue our study in the Gospel of John with Pastor Dax.
John 1:14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. I've had my eye on this verse for quite a while now. I've known this day was coming when this verse would come up. And I still feel this morning inadequate and unprepared, really, to handle this verse. I've got that feeling where you know that you need more time, but you're out of time. And I'm not sure really that any amount of time would have been sufficient to plumb the depths of this verse. I've been so excited to get into the prologue, these first 18 verses of John's Gospel. Because as our church grows, I've just been feeling the necessity to set before us in a very central manner who Jesus Christ really is. I think that's so important because of the overwhelming need that we see in the time and the place in which we live. Even, here in Eastern Oregon, most people share pretty conservative and pretty traditional values, but even in a place like this that we call home, we're not immune from the creep of relativism and secularism and pluralism and all the other isms. That we're definitely not immune to that because of this place. And we expect that from the world, right? We expect that from the culture that we live in. But as some of you may have even experienced, those things have crept into the broader church as well. I just don't know, based on my experience, that there are that many places that speak exclusively and unashamedly about Jesus Christ. There's a lot of sermons preached every Sunday all over this country, just not necessarily a lot of gospel. And that's why these last several weeks have been so exhilarating for me, and I hope for you, because John's prologue, these first 18 verses, is just not another message about a vague sense of hope out there somewhere. It's about a message that contains the only hope, Jesus Christ. And at the very heart and soul of all of it sits what we have right here in front of us this morning in verse 14. And the Word became flesh. And the fact is, that's not just at the heart of this prologue. That verse really sits at the heart of this whole gospel. And beyond that, you could even argue this verse sits at the locus of the entire Bible. And I don't think I'm overstating that. Not even a little bit. You take away this verse, John 1:14, and Christianity collapses. It becomes just another hopeless attempt by spiritually blind people to reach and find their way to God. In other words, it becomes like all the other religions that we see, and in that sense it fits very well with our time and our culture. But, however, if verse 14 stands, that means that Christianity is unique. It's uniquely a movement in the opposite direction. God himself coming to us. God himself reaching out to us. God himself in loving pursuit of us. No, I don't think it's possible to overstate the significance of this verse. And the Word became flesh. And the Word, the eternal Word, became flesh. No Christian doctrine has been more attacked than this doctrine, what we call the incarnation. And this is not just for theologians in ivory towers. This is critical for you to understand, this doctrine here that's captured in verse 14. Because if you get this wrong, you miss everything. John MacArthur has said, It is as damning to believe in the wrong Jesus as it is to believe in no Jesus. Do you catch that? It's as damning to believe in the wrong Jesus as it is to believe in no Jesus. Understanding the truth of the identity of Jesus Christ in this verse is critical to your Christian faith. In fact, I would go so far to say if you don't understand and believe this verse, you are not a Christian. And in these last few verses here, from verses 14 through 18, John's prologue, John's overture, it's slowly climbing to its zenith here, to its high point. And now, from that lofty vantage point, we can see and ask our fifth and final question. We'll see the answer to that question that we've been asking lately. Who is this Jesus? And this fifth answer is something that is nothing short of staggering for us. In fact, so much so that we'll take this Sunday and next Sunday to fully unpack what's in this last few verses. Who is this Jesus? That's what we've been asking here lately. Here now is our fifth and final answer to that question. Jesus is the ultimate exposition of God. Jesus is the ultimate exposition of God. In other words, Jesus is the comprehensive description and explanation of who God is. And that reality is bound up with one event here that John captures in 5 short words there at the beginning of verse 14, and the Word became flesh. It's been a while since John has used that term, word. So we need to remind ourselves, I think, who is this Word from the text? And the Word became flesh? Look up again at verse 1 there, just as a reminder who we're talking about. Verse 1, in the beginning was the Word. In the beginning. He's the eternal one. And the Word was with God. He's God's own equal. And the Word was God. He is God himself. Now, in light of that, of who that Word is, verse 14, and the Word, this same Word became flesh. And notice what it does not say. It doesn't say that the Word changed into flesh. The Word didn't change into flesh or change his nature to become flesh. To state it that way might imply that by becoming human, Jesus in some way gave up his deity. So John says exactly what he means here. And the Word became flesh. In other words, he became something that he previously was not. The point I'm trying to make is this. The incarnation, Jesus coming into the world, is not about subtraction. The incarnation is about addition. Without surrendering any of his deity in any way, the eternal Word added to himself flesh. Really, this is John's kind of graphic way of saying God the Son, the eternal Word, took on a full human nature with all of the inherent weaknesses and vulnerabilities that come along with being human. So now, what we're saying here is two things, right? On the one hand, Jesus' full compromised deity. Verse 1 makes that clear. On the other hand, Jesus' full uncompromised humanity. But he's only one person. So how do those two natures work together in this one person? I haven't a clue. I have some clues. But throughout history, the church has attempted to formulate some theological statements that help explain all this and unpack all of this. Even so, though, I would remind you, even so, the Apostle Paul refers to this as the mystery of godliness. The mystery of godliness. There are some things that are in the Bible that are so deep, so mysterious, altogether true, right? Altogether real, mind you, but they're so deep and so mysterious that they're better to be adored than they are to be fully explained. You start putting your grubby little hands all over these things, trying to get it just right, and you will mess the whole thing up. Instead, just consider what Scripture reveals about Jesus, the God-man. He's an embryo in the womb of a woman. And yet, he's the sovereign Lord of the universe. He's a newborn son in Bethlehem, and yet Isaiah calls him the everlasting Father. He's so exhausted that he falls asleep in a fishing boat, and yet with one spoken word, he quiets the raging storm. In the Garden of Gethsemane, his soul is troubled, yet he's the Prince of Peace. He weeps at the tomb of Lazarus, his friend, and yet he shows his authority over death by calling Lazarus out from the grave. Jesus Christ is in every way fully divine, and Jesus Christ is in every way fully human. With one notable exception: the experience of sin. But you need to understand, that doesn't make Jesus less human than you. To the contrary, that means that Jesus is more human than any of us. Sin is not an essential ingredient to authentic humanity. In fact, sin is an intruder that serves to make you less than human, less than your potential. This is why Jesus is the ultimate man. He's the ultimate human being. Galatians tells us that Jesus was born of a woman, born under the law. The writer of Hebrews tells us that Jesus shares the same flesh and blood as fallen humanity. Romans says that Jesus came in the likeness of sinful man. Luke tells us that Jesus was circumcised, receiving the mark of the old covenant. Luke adds that Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature. Physically and intellectually, he matured. We read that he hungers, Luke 4. We read that he thirsts and grows weary, John 4. That he feels agony, Matthew 26. That he dies, John 19. That blood and water pour out of his side when he's pierced. He had a real human body, a real human mind, real human emotions. And all of the same weaknesses of the flesh that you and I experience. And the Word, this eternal Word, became flesh. He added to his deity humanity. God and man joined in one person. As my old pastor used to say, God in the bod. Never to be separated. Not half God and half man. Two perfect yet distinct natures in one body. Not mingled or mixed in any way. To be a Christian, you must believe this. That Jesus Christ is the eternal God Almighty who took on the flesh of humanity. It's a non-negotiable. And as important as that is, that's not all John wants to say to us here, though, not by a long shot. That this Word became flesh, he wants us to understand, is nothing less than the ultimate exposition of God himself. And the way in which he sets this forth for us is breathtaking when you see it. How does he show us this? How many of you love movies? Got some movie lovers? There's some movies that we all know so well that you could probably get up here and quote and react them out, right? You know every line from the movie. Or there's some movies where there's certain lines trigger those scenes from the movie. You can see it just like you're watching it again. Have you experienced that? You know what I'm talking about? So when I say, Toto, I've a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. What movie? Wizard of Oz, right? Or Luke, I am your father. What movie? No purists in here? Okay, there we go. Not just Star Wars. Yeah, Empire Strikes Back. How about I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Apocalypse Now. There you go. Show Me the Money. Jerry Maguire. There's a movie fan back there. I hear you. And we could go on and on. I'm guessing most of you have that experience, right? The thing is, for people who are well-versed in the storyline of the Bible, something similar happens when you read the New Testament. It triggers your memory to recall scenes from the Old Testament. Scenes that foreshadowed what you're now reading about in the New Testament. In other words, as Kent Hughes puts it, you read your Bible backwards. And that's exactly what John's counting on here in the remainder of this verse, really in the remainder of this prologue, as he conveys several truths now about who Jesus Christ is that will collectively reveal him to be the ultimate exposition of God. But to fully appreciate these wonderful truths, you have to see them in relationship to their Old Testament anticipations. So this morning, what I'd like us to do is consider three of them, and we'll save the last two for next time. Look at the verse. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. More literally, tabernacled among us. Does that word sound familiar? Does it trigger any images in your mind from the Old Testament? I hope so. It should. It's designed to do that very thing. When God formally entered into a relationship with Israel, he made this covenantal commitment to them. I will be their God, they will be my people. And to sort of seal the deal, he manifested his presence inside this portable tent called the tabernacle. In Exodus 33, Moses refers to this tent as the tent of meeting. Why? Well, because inside the tabernacle was the most holy place, right? Where the high priest could enter once a year on behalf of himself and on behalf of the other Israelites to offer the blood of a sacrificial substitute. It was the meeting place that served to bring together the holy God and his people. The tabernacle. The meeting place. This now is the image that John intentionally draws upon when he says, and the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. His claim is nothing less than this. Jesus Christ is now the meeting place. Jesus Christ is the tabernacle. He is the fulfillment of everything the tabernacle foreshadowed. And this is really the first of these wonderful truths about Jesus Christ. He is the one in whom God and humans meet. He's the meeting place. He's where God and humans meet. Do you wish to meet God, maybe even this morning? There's some of you here who I don't know very well or don't even know at all. Maybe that's why you're here. You want to meet with God. If that's the case, let me assure you, he is very happy to meet with you. How do I know that? He's already arranged the meeting place. Jesus Christ. He is the tent of meeting. He superseded the tabernacle, you see, by coming himself in flesh to tabernacle with us. He's now the place where God and human beings come together. Let me ask you, what else do you know about the tabernacle? What was inside the most holy place where the high priest entered once a year? The Ark of the Covenant. Right? And what was on top of the Ark of the Covenant? Do you remember? The mercy seat. And do you remember there on both sides of the mercy seat were cherubim, angels who are uniquely associated with the presence of God. And there, just above the mercy seat and in between the cherubim, God placed his glory. His unique, visible manifestation of his presence. Now, as you recall the story, in the Old Testament there, you'll remember the portable tabernacle, the tent of meeting, was eventually replaced by what? The temple, right. And again, within the temple, inside the most holy place, God located the unique, visible manifestation of his presence, of his glory. And if you're still thinking about the Old Testament story, what eventually happened to that glory, to that visible manifestation of God's presence? Remember the vision that Ezekiel is given? Because of Israel's unrepentant idolatry, he sees the glory of the Lord leave the temple. And the temple, once the holiest place on the planet, is now just a God-forsaken shell. But what's interesting there is that Ezekiel has a later vision towards the end of his book. And this prophecy concludes by saying that the glory of God would return one day to a temple. The glory of God would return to a temple. A temple for the last days is the context. But friends, you need to realize this last days temple is not a building connected to a piece of real estate in the Middle East. This temple is a man. And the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we have seen his, what? There it is, glory. And what does Jesus himself say in the very next chapter of John's Gospel? In John 2, verse 19. You might want to flip over there to see this. In John 2:19, Jesus says, destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. And then John adds a couple verses later for those of us who are playing along at home, but he was speaking about the temple of his body. You realize what John's saying here? He's saying that in Jesus, the glory of God has returned. Just as the tabernacle prefigured, just as the temple prefigured, just as God promised through Ezekiel, the glory of God has come back. God's glory is manifested in Jesus Christ. He is the last day's temple. It's really the second of these wonderful truths about Jesus Christ. He is the one in whom God's glory is made manifest. And it's really just this simple. If you want to most fully see the glory of God, look at the face of Jesus Christ. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. We have seen his glory, John says. Now, what Old Testament scene should that trigger in your mind? Let me help you here. I think it's the scene where between God and Moses after the debacle of the golden calf. Because do you remember what Moses audaciously asks of God, and God, because he can see Moses' heart, is merciful to him in this? It's in Exodus 33, where Moses says, please show me your glory. God's reply is interesting. Please show me your glory. I will make all my goodness pass before you. In other words, God's glory, by his own definition, is displayed supremely as his goodness. But if you remember, Moses can't really see it, not in its fullness, or he'll die. It's far safer for him to just hear of it as he's hidden. So this is what he hears when God reveals his glory to him, when God reveals his goodness. This is what God proclaims as Moses just glimpses the afterglow of the glory that passes by. God says, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Now, I want you to watch what John does here, okay? This is pretty amazing. God's glory is supremely displayed as his goodness. And the nature of his goodness is described most clearly in those last two words from Exodus 33, steadfast love and faithfulness. Steadfast love and faithfulness. In the Old Testament, those two words are paired together dozens and dozens of times to most fully express who God is. And those two words in Hebrew, his hesed and his emet, they find their precise New Testament counterparts in the words John chooses to use. Charis kai aletheia, grace and truth. So what? Who cares? I think John cares. Look at verse 14 again. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. See what John's saying here? I want you to grasp this. He's saying that everything that was only ever true about Yahweh in the Old Testament is now presented to us and made manifest in this Word who has become flesh. Are you getting that? You understand what I'm saying? That's a huge statement. These things that were only ever true about Yahweh in the Old Testament are now most fully seen in Jesus Christ. In other words, what Moses could only hear about, we can see in Jesus Christ fully. He's the one in whom God and humans meet. He's the one in whom God's glory is made manifest. Thirdly now, he's the one in whom God's goodness is materialized. What Moses could only hear, we see. We have seen his glory, full of grace and truth. By the way, where did the disciples see this glory of God in Jesus? I mean, if you were to ask them, where did you see the glory of God in Jesus? Did he walk around with, a little halo floating over his head? Or where did you see it? And if you think about the stories, you might think, well, maybe in the miracles that Jesus performed. And that's right. You would see that there. That's correct. For example, after he turned water into wine, again in John chapter 2, we read this. This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and listen, manifested his glory. John says that was the very first time. We knew that Jesus was the Messiah, but on that day in Cana, his glory burst forth. And don't forget, John was there with James and Peter on the Mount of Transfiguration where Jesus' glory shone through so brightly they had to fall on their faces. But actually, neither of those were the greatest expressions of glory that his disciples witnessed. There's a hint right here in this verse, in something that I've skipped over. Notice, and we have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father. Glory as of the only Son from the Father. He's the Father's unique, one-of-a-kind Son. But this word translated here only, what's called the monogenes, what Old Testament scene should it conjure up in your mind? Let me give you a clue. Think about your Old Testament. A father is required to sacrifice what the text says is his only son. You say Abraham and Isaac. You're exactly right. And Hebrews 11:17, in looking back at that episode of Abraham and Isaac, uses this exact same word here to refer to Abraham's one-of-a-kind son, his monogenes. In other words, Isaac, the son to be sacrificed, was a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, the son to be sacrificed. See, in the Gospel of John, the greatest display of the glory of God is seen most explicitly when Jesus is hung and lifted up on the cross. That is where you see the glory of God. Does that surprise you? When you think of the humiliation? When you think about the abuse? When you think about everything that was suffered there, do you think of glory, first of all? Probably not, but listen to Jesus' own words. Jesus, speaking of his pending death in John chapter 12, says, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." And he goes on to say, "Now is my soul troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name." And then a voice comes from heaven, "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." Friends, do you understand what's being said here? The most spectacular display of the glory of God is not found in his miracles or in his mighty works. It's found in that bloody instrument of torture that we call the cross. Because it was there that the goodness of God, his steadfast love and faithfulness, his grace and his truth was seen most brilliantly. You want to see glory? Gaze upon the cross. You can do without miracles. You cannot do without the cross. Not if it's glory that you want. And maybe you wonder, why is it always the gospel here at Victory? Why is it always about Jesus here at Victory? Well, I'll let you in on a little secret. It's my job to set before you glory. And here's the secret, is that I know you want glory. I know that the deepest thirst of every human heart is the glory of God, whether it's suppressed or not. And where do you see the glory of God most plainly, most brilliantly? In the Word become flesh. The Word who in the act of salvation provided you with the greatest expression of glory that you will ever see. And the moment you begin to move away from the cross, the moment you begin to move away from the centrality of Jesus and the centrality of the gospel, is the moment you move away from glory. I don't care how big the church is. I don't care how good the speaker is. I don't care how great the music is. I don't care how cool it is. You move away from glory the moment you step away from the centrality of the cross. And the Word became flesh. Why? Why did the Word become flesh? Certainly to identify with you. To really understand, truly understand all of your weaknesses, all of your struggles, all of your temptations, all of your sufferings, to really be the sympathetic great high priest, the very presence of God with you, to know you in that way. Also, he came certainly to affirm you. He became flesh to affirm your human existence. And really to once and for all shatter and do away with that false notion that the spiritual is good but the physical is bad. No, the Word became flesh. But most importantly, the Word became flesh to save you. And in that act of saving you was where his glory was most fully revealed. It's where his glory was displayed most clearly because, you see, as a person, I'm speaking of all of us, who has failed to live up to God's standard, death is exactly what you deserve from a God who is holy and just. Death. Unless there's a substitute to die in your place, to take on that death. But not just any substitute, right? Because I can't die for you and you can't die for me, not in a way that means anything. Two kids sitting in a mud puddle together can't clean each other up. No, we need a substitute that's clean. More than that, we need a substitute who is of such inherent value and worth that he could take the price of sin for the whole world, if needed. He could die for an entire world of sinners. You can't do that. I can't do that. This is why the Word became flesh. This is why the Word became something he previously was not. It's why he added humanity to his deity, so that he could die a death in our place and display his glory to the world in the greatest possible way. The glory that is supremely displayed in his goodness that has expressed itself most plainly in his grace and truth. And the Word became flesh. Everything about your eternity hinges on those 5 simple words. And the Word became flesh.
We would like to thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. This podcast is a ministry of Victory Baptist Church in Hermiston, Oregon. You can find us at 193 East Main Street in Hermiston, Oregon, 97838, or on the web at yourvictory.org.